We do have another caller on the line. We have William from Texas. William?
Should we consider Hades and Earth to be one and the same place?
So could the point be made?
What does verses 17 and 18 mean?
John the Baptist?
Not Christian.
Great question. Great question. Good evening and welcome again to GBN Live. I'm Mike Hickson. We're so glad that you're with us tonight. We appreciate your presence tonight, and we hope and pray that our topic is going to be beneficial to you. We are going to be discussing tonight the subject of gossip, and we hope you'll stay tuned. You may telephone us at 1-888-805-3390. Again, that telephone number, 1-888-805-3390. You might want to email us a question or a comment at gbnlive@gbntv.org, or feel free to tweet us at #GBNLive. I want to begin by introducing our guest tonight. We have with us Don Blackwell, and Don is the director of GBN, and we're so grateful that he's with us tonight. And as always, Don, welcome.
Thank you. Always good to be here, Mike.
We also have with us Don Walker. We have two Dons with us tonight. We're glad to have Don Walker. Don is an instructor at the Memphis School of Preaching, and he has also been with us on numerous occasions, and we appreciate so much his ability and his knowledge. And Don, glad to have you with us.
Mike, I'm glad to be here tonight. Thank you.
As we begin tonight talking about the subject of gossip, this is a subject that really needs a lot of emphasis because the Bible has a lot to say about gossip, about being a slanderer, etc. And so as we begin our program tonight, maybe to set the stage, let's just begin by way of defining the word gossip. Don, how would you define gossip?
I actually did a little preparation today and did some research to get the definition of the word gossip. I looked up what the Greek definition of this is, and one of the lexicons defined it this way: pertaining to meddling in someone else's business, being a busybody, meddling. And I searched some different translations for the word gossip. I found in the King James the word gossip does not appear. It appears in the New King James one time. That's in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 13. It's grouped there with busybodies. I looked up the secular definition, that is Merriam-Webster, says gossip is information and behavior and about the personal lives of other people. And it says a rumor or a report of an intimate nature. It can be true or false.
Sure.
And can still be gossip. And so that's the biblical definition. I looked up to see what words the King James uses. Instead of using the word gossip, it uses the word a tattler. And sometimes it uses the word a whisperer.
That's right. That's right. As a matter of fact, in First Timothy chapter 5, verse 13, the passage you mentioned a moment ago, Paul there speaks of tattlers,
right,
or gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Don, I guess that passage was brought up a moment ago. Why do you think that gossiping and being a busybody go hand in hand?
Well, I think a lot of it is depending on how the individual looks at themselves. It provides those who are perhaps weak or those who have issues with themselves an opportunity in their minds at least to build themselves up, to show themselves as being important. I know something that you don't know, for a lot of people, will put them in their own minds at least at a level different from others. And it brings some import that they feel like that they may be missing in other areas, I believe is one.
I think that's a great observation. Do you think it's possible that some people engage in gossip and really don't understand the magnitude of what they're doing?
Oh, absolutely. When you think about this concept of the busybody and the gossip and talking about the two of these things going together, a busybody gets involved in other people's business and the gossip then talks about it. So those two things are almost always going to be paired together. In fact, I looked up the word in the Greek here for busybodies, and one lexicon said this word should be rendered as gossipy.
Okay.
And I thought that was very interesting. But no, I don't think oftentimes people realize the damage they're doing. And if they would stop and consider that, I think a good-hearted person would not do it. But they get some sort of pleasure out of doing it, and they don't consider the consequences. Oftentimes that's the case with all sin.
Sure, sure. Do you think that there's a possibility that gossip could become a habit? Sometimes we talk about bad habits, people that smoke and drink, etc. But is it possible for someone to develop the habit of engaging in consistent, constant gossip?
Oh, I believe that's definitely the fact. You look at our society, and all of the news around those in Hollywood and this and that are all gossip magazines. And maybe some of it's true, maybe it's not, but that's what people want to hear.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sometimes, and I think about what you gentlemen have said thus far, and it seems to me that people today are looking to hear the smut, the bad news, and it seems like some people relish the worse the news, the better. And then I think the goal is to try to broadcast it far and wide.
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to think about this as I was preparing for this program, to think, why is gossip so pleasurable for people? Why is that such an appealing thing? And I thought about what the Bible says in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16, all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. He says all sin can be classified into one of these three areas. Well, gossip, I thought that's not the lust of the flesh. It's not the lust of the eyes. I thought it has to be the pride of life. There's something involved in the pride of life. Maybe it's the idea that when I speak ill of other people, that I push them down, and maybe I'm exalting myself. Maybe there's a pride, a thrill from that.
Sure.
Maybe there's a thrill involved in it because I like to have something juicy. I'm the first to know.
That's right.
There's a thrill involved in that aspect of it, and that was the two things that I came up with to think about why this is so appealing to people.
I think that's a great point. And I think that the steamier the news, so to speak, the more desirous people have to share that with other people. Why do you think that there is such a tendency on the part of people to get caught up in gossip? And when I think about this question, I know that we understand there are certain elements in the world, but sometimes those elements make their way into the church. And people that ought to know better and ought to do better sometimes get caught up in gossip.
I think it may be that sometimes that is really the only time we feel like someone's really listening to what we have to say. That this is something, it catches their ear, the more shocking, then we have their attention, and we crave that. And of course, if we have the right mindset, we'd like to have everyone's attention when we're talking about wholesome things, spiritual matters, and those things, but those are not topics that are common today, and people aren't interested in that. But these others, if I really have that news, then I've got your attention.
I think so. In the book of James is probably one of the most practical books in the New Testament, and the Old Testament counterpart to James would be the book of Proverbs. And James has a lot to say about the tongue. And in James chapter 1, verse 26, James says, if anyone among you thinks that he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. And I think about the importance of learning to bridle the tongue. Don, don't you think that one of the most difficult things for people to do in and out of the church is to somehow put a bridle on the tongue?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, James talks about that just a few verses prior to the verse you just read. He says, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. And so he says, we need to be slow, we need to be careful before we speak. And then when you talk about the tongue, when you get to chapter 3, he has a lengthy passage talking about the tongue. And he says in James chapter 3 and verse 1, my brethren, be not many masters, the word here meaning teachers, knowing that we shall receive greater condemnation. That is, you're going to be accountable for the words you speak, even when you're teaching. For in many things we offend in all, that is, we stumble. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man and able to bridle the whole body. In other words, it's going to happen to all of us. We all do it. He says only a perfect man would not do that. And so we all put our foot in our mouth sometimes.
Absolutely.
I was thinking about in James chapter 1 when he talks about the temptations, let no man say when he is tempted, I'm tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust. And I was thinking about how it is that different people have different temptations. One man is tempted by alcohol, and that doesn't appeal to me at all, and another man is tempted by this. But the tongue is one that hits all of us. This is just across the board. Every person alive, and that's the point that James makes. Only a perfect man is going to be exempt from this.
And you know, in James chapter 3, he's talking about the consistency aspect of the tongue. Right. Because as he said in James chapter 3, you know, on the one hand, somebody's praising God. On the other hand, they're cursing their fellow neighbor. And so he said, you know, my brethren, these things ought not so to be. And I think that when we talk about gossip, that really is applicable. So sometimes people engage in gossip and unwittingly continue to pass on information that doesn't need to be shared.
Well, I think that's right, and a lot of it we don't think. We speak without thinking, and we find ourselves in trouble. We talked about the definition of gossip. There's a very practical definition that I've heard, and that is when we share private information with those who are not part of the problem or those who are not part of the solution. And so you're talking with someone that cannot affect the situation. That's gossip. Now, how many times do we stop and think about it from that perspective? If I'm talking to you, okay, what are you going to be able to do to help the situation if it's a negative situation?
Sure.
And if there's someone that can't help, idle words, empty words that have no value. And Jesus said in Mark 12:36, I believe it was, or Matthew 12:36, that we will be judged by every idle word that comes out of the mouth.
That's exactly right.
And I don't know if there's another verse that's as sobering or more sobering than that thought right there.
I think that it reveals the gravity of our speech and the fact that we are accountable to Almighty God. And as you said, Jesus said, every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give an account thereof in the day of judgment. That's sobering.
Right.
And it ought to get our attention.
Mike, you know, I really appreciate what Don just said, because when you think about the definition of gossip, when you have a conversation about someone else and it involves something negative, there's intent involved in this. Because sometimes we are saying something about someone that's negative, but it's out of concern and it's out of a desire to help them. And I think sometimes as we have preached and taught on this, people have reached the conclusion that you can't ever say anything bad or communicate any negative information. But, you know, elders in the Lord's church, in order to help and deal with problems, they have to share information that's not always good information. If we are going to help our brother in Christ, sometimes we're going to have to share information. So there's intent that's involved in this.
That's right. Well, and I think, as Solomon said, knowing that there's a time to speak and a time to be silent. And there are some things that, quite frankly, there are situations that occur within the context of a congregation, sometimes very sensitive situations. And obviously there may be certain people that are in the know. And yet that problem needs to be remedied from the vantage point of the eldership and the people that are involved in that problem. And it doesn't need to become a very public affair, because sometimes people begin to politicize and really draw lines in the sand, and before you know it, the church is divided. And that happens.
Well, the Lord has put a process in place for matters such as that, and the first step is never broadcast it to everyone. You go to them, you work with them. If that doesn't work, perhaps take someone with you, another witness or two. If that doesn't work, then you turn and you call upon the congregation. And even that is from the context of, now, there are members who are closer to some of these people than we might be. Let's help them get back where they want to be.
That's right.
You can undermine that very easily if you get ahead of yourself, or if you have those who have a different attitude or a different desire from what's unfolding before them.
Absolutely. We have a caller tonight, Roger Leonard, who is the preacher for the Adel Church of Christ in Adel, Georgia, which is South Georgia, is on the line with us, and I want to take his call at this time. Roger, good to have you on the program.
Thank you for asking me to call, Mike. I appreciate you, brethren, very much.
Well, we appreciate you, Roger, and we were talking just a moment ago about situations where problems may occur between two members. And there are certain divine instructions given by Jesus in Matthew chapter 18 about how to reconcile that situation. But sometimes, unfortunately, when people have problems, rather than going directly to one another and trying to rectify that problem, one or both parties begin to talk to other parties, and before you know it, you've got a monumental problem on your hands.
That's true. And I think a lot of times we may not realize that we're doing harm, but Jesus said if your brother sins against you, to go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. And you really should be trying to seek to solve the issue, and that way it could be solved and maybe other people wouldn't know about it. But our habits sometimes are not the best, and we want to tell everybody else, and then all of a sudden a person can get a bad reputation from something that may not even be true.
That's right.
And even if it is, it should be solved between brethren like Jesus said to do.
You know, Roger, I was just thinking as you were talking a moment ago, why is it sometimes that we are reluctant to follow the divine commands of God? For example, Matthew chapter 18, very clear cut, can't misunderstand it, and yet sometimes rather than simply honoring what Jesus said, we short-circuit the whole process and don't do anything that he said.
I guess it depends on the person. We could be afraid that we would lose a friend, or they would get mad and stop coming to worship services, or they may think badly about us. But I really think the way you approach a person with that can make a big difference. And going to them in love and say, look, I understand that, and try to explain what you do understand and say, I'd like to see if we can get to the bottom of it or clear it up, and talk to them the way you want to be talked to, and try to resolve the issue. We're not meeting with people to beat them up or to berate them, but try to help them.
And Roger, in light of that, in Matthew chapter 18, verse 15, as you were mentioning a moment ago, and as Don mentioned as well, Jesus said, you go and tell him his fault between you and him, and I would stress that word alone. It doesn't need to be something that is of a public nature at this point in time. And when we fail to honor what Jesus says, a lot of times we open the door to even greater problems than what we have initially on the front end.
Well, and Jesus did say if your brother sins against you, and we've got to decide whether or not someone sinned. And if you think that they did, so, I believe that something happened here that's against God's will, and I'd like for us together to try and resolve it. I think humility goes a long way, but sometimes we don't do it because we're afraid they'll reject us or get mad, or maybe they'll go start talking about us. There are different reasons. But
yeah, I agree with you. As a matter of fact, I couldn't help but think about how sometimes people will become offended at something someone has said or done, and the person who has, quote unquote, offended them doesn't even know that they're in the wrong. They don't know anything about it. And rather than the person who feels offended, rather than that person going to them and saying, look, you said this or you did this, and you really hurt me by doing that, rather than doing that, they go, as you mentioned a moment ago, and tell everyone about it. When really the person that wronged them has no idea they wronged them. Mm-hmm.
That's true. I believe that even applies to marriage situations. As a minister of the gospel, I have tried to talk with married couples. If you have a real problem with your spouse, please do your best to try to resolve that between you first. And you may not even need to speak with someone else. But don't tell me anything that you're not comfortable with me knowing. Of course, sometimes people do need help. And if someone does come to us with an issue, say, well, we really need to go talk to this person, I think sometimes we can facilitate the sin of the gossip ourselves. Sure. By not insisting, especially those of us who are ministers, insisting that the person who may come to us go to the person that they're having an issue with and try to resolve it. And if they need a third party, that could or could not be brought about. But it's a very touchy situation, to say the least. But our goal should be to help people do what God wants, no matter how uncomfortable we are at times with having to confront people.
I think you're exactly right. You mentioned a moment ago the characteristics that ought to accompany our meetings with other people. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, Paul talks about someone who has been overtaken in a trespass and a sin, and he said those who are spiritual are to go in a spirit of gentleness or meekness, considering themselves lest they also be tempted. Do you think sometimes maybe our attitude is not what it ought to be?
It can be, and maybe one of the reasons people have not been successful in restoration efforts, for example, is the approach they take. One of the things I try to do when I speak with people is put myself on the same level and remind them I sin too, and I'm not here to exalt myself above you, but there is something we need to discuss. And your approach can make a lot of difference. And I think sometimes we're good at driving people away instead of trying to draw them closer to the Lord with our own attitudes.
I think so. As you were talking a moment ago, the golden rule seems to be applicable, doesn't it, gentlemen?
Absolutely. The golden rule, we're thinking about the proper way to treat people and the way we want them to treat us. And it goes back to the question you brought up a few minutes ago, Mike, and that is, do you think people always consider the damage that's done by gossip? If you apply the golden rule to this and they thought about how it would affect them, then oftentimes they would not do this.
That's right. That's right.
You know, Mike, I think you hit on it just a moment ago, and it hits to the heart of the problem. Galatians 6:1, ye who are spiritual, go to them in a manner of meekness. Jesus said, by their fruits ye shall know them. He was talking about false teachers, but that's going to be true of anybody.
Sure.
You look at a character such as Joseph. When Joseph saw that Mary was with child, and he did not know at that time what had happened, he was going to put her away privately. He didn't want to embarrass her. He didn't want to make her a spectacle. Joseph was a good man, a just man, and you see that in his actions. And we need to, when we find ourselves in these positions, either side, either about to say something that we ought not to say or listen to something that we ought not to hear, we've got to stop and ask ourselves, okay, is this really showing myself to be the spiritual one? The carnal Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 20, part of their problem is slanderers.
That's right.
And if we would stop and think about, okay, am I really being spiritual, or am I slandering someone? Do I really want the good of this individual, or do I just want to elevate myself? Whatever happens to them doesn't matter. We really define who we are, and we need to think about that.
And here's a verse to go with what Don is saying, Proverbs 17:28. Even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. Right. When he shuts his lips, he's considered perceptive. I can remember, in fact, a lot of us can probably remember our mothers telling us it's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. That's right. And that's right out of the Bible. Sure and the question is, a wise man knows when to keep his mouth shut. That's right. And that goes back to the one who is spiritually minded.
I think so. Roger, one of the things that I want to ask you just very quickly, in the book of Proverbs, in chapter 20, verse 19, Solomon said, he that goeth about as a talebearer revealeth secrets. As a gospel preacher, I know that, well, all of us are gospel preachers, and I know that sometimes people will come to us and discuss certain sensitive subjects, and they come to us in confidence. And sometimes, sadly, people betray the confidence of those who have come to them. How important is it for a gospel preacher to maintain the confidentiality of something that has been said to him?
It has to be maintained 100%, because if people can't trust you with that information, then you don't need to talk to them, or they don't need to listen to them. I tell people when they come and speak with me about personal matters, even if nobody else knows it, if it's not about another person, well, whatever you're telling me stays with me. If you want to talk about something that's going on with someone else, then I would suggest you not tell me anything about that, but maybe give me some, ideas of what's going on, and maybe I can help you to resolve it. But confidentiality has to be 100% because people have to trust us.
I think so. I think so. As a matter of fact, I think about how when we stand before people, we have to have a certain amount of credibility in the presentation of the gospel, and really there becomes a trust factor. If when people come to us in confidence, if we betray that confidence, then there is a lack of trust, and there becomes a breach within the church, and that can add to a lot of trouble.
Mike, I remember hearing a preacher say that he kept a logbook on his desk, and when people would come in and start to tell him something about another person that he perceived to be gossip in nature, he would turn the book around and say, I would like you to write it down and sign your name under it. And he said oftentimes that put a stop to it.
Wow, it's powerful, powerful. Roger, thank you so much for calling. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just add one little thing to this. This also applies to elderships. And elders get told things by brethren, and they have to keep things like this private, and they can't tell anyone. And people do need help, and I appreciate you bringing that up because it is so important when people are talking with us that we try to lead them to God and to solve the issue and not share it with anyone.
You know, I think you're right. And you mentioned elders just a minute ago, and there are certain things that as an elder, as a preacher, there are certain issues that we become involved in, and sometimes those issues are very sensitive in nature. And one of the things that I choose to do sometimes is I don't even tell my wife things that are going on because I don't want her to know. And I don't want somebody going to her and trying to pry something out of her, so I just don't tell her certain things that there's really no need for her to know. And yet, I know that there have been times when gospel preachers and or elders have shared information with their wives, thinking that they're not betraying a confidence, and before you know it, it becomes broadcast in the congregation. There's a leak, so to speak, yeah. And that's a terrible thing. And again, it goes back to that can destroy the credibility of an eldership and or the preacher as well.
Mike, this is a little off subject, but before I was a preacher, I served in the United States Air Force, and I was in Air Force intelligence. And I had a top secret clearance. In fact, my clearance was beyond top secret. And so I was privy to information on a daily basis that was not allowed to leave that building. I could not talk to my wife about it. It could not be said under any circumstances. And the penalty for that was even imprisonment. And if a preacher would adopt that same mindset, then we would not have a lot of the problems that we do.
I think so. Sometimes I think about, there might be information out there, but they didn't get it from me.
Right.
Because I'm not going to say a word about it. And I think that's a great way to look at it, Don. Roger, thank you so much for taking time to call in tonight. We appreciate all the great work you're doing in South Georgia and appreciate your love for the lost and what you mean to the kingdom.
Thank you for the topic, and we appreciate GBN very much. God bless.
Hey, thank you so much. In our discussion, we've talked about evil speaking. In James chapter 4, James discusses the danger of engaging in evil speaking. But doesn't there have to be, the flip side of that, there has to be a desire to listen to what's being said. How should someone deal with a person that comes to them with gossip? Don, how would you respond to them?
As a preacher, when someone would come and want to talk about someone else, I'd stand up and say, okay, come on. Let's go get in the car, we'll drive over there, sit down, and then we'll deal with this problem. And a lot of times that'll save you a lot of time because I didn't have very many takers as far as that goes. And participation in it is an action of condoning what's going on. And we have to determine if we're going to condone it or not and just put a stop to it.
Sure.
And sometimes, if it's an individual that's thinking properly, perhaps they'll rethink what they're doing and reevaluate.
Brother Gann Woods said that there is evil speaking and evil hearing. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. We add fuel to the fire when we listen attentively, and then sometimes maybe, again, unwittingly, we pass that information on.
You know, Proverbs 26:20 says, where there is no wood, the fire goes out. That's right. There are certain things that are necessary for a fire to burn. You can take one of those away and the fire will cease. I thought about this in Romans chapter 1 and verse 32. He gives a list of things there that were characteristics of the evil, degenerate Gentiles in years past. And he goes through some very serious things: sexual immorality and covetousness and envy and murder and strife and evil-mindedness. But in the end of verse 29, in the King James, he says whisperers. And then verse 30, he says backbiters. He groups this with haters of God, proud, boasters. But then it's very interesting because he gets to verse 32, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also those who approve of them who practice them. So he condemns whisperers and backbiters, but also those who approve of it. Well, that would be the person who's going to listen and participate in it. So they are just as guilty and equally condemned, according to Romans 1.
Absolutely. We mentioned a moment ago the golden rule, Matthew chapter 7. And in light of what we're discussing today, wouldn't it be a good idea for someone to ask the question, okay, if that were me, would I want someone talking about me in that way? Or passing information around about me?
Exactly. And if someone is doing that, we're ready to confront them about it if we know about it.
Sure.
And you haven't done right by me. You've treated me unfairly. You're not acting like a good Christian. You're not acting the way you ought to.
Yeah, you know, in Ephesians chapter 4, Paul contrasts the old man of sin and the new man in Christ. And obviously there is to be a tremendous change inwardly in a person who becomes a child of God. In verse 29 of chapter 4, he said, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying. Wouldn't it be a good, maybe, rule of thumb to ask the question about what we're going to, maybe certain pertinent information, if we're getting ready to pass it on, ask the question, does it meet the litmus test of edification?
And just immediately after saying that in verse 29, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. And verse 32, he says, and be kind to one another. And so as we're thinking about the words that are going to come out of our mouth, he said, I want you to think about this. Is it something that is kind? And then he talks about forgiveness. And that also is going to play into this. You know, Mike, one of the things I think people don't think about oftentimes is how widespread gossip gets. I taught a youth rally one time, and to illustrate my point, I got a cup of confetti. In fact, you know when you use a hole puncher and it punches these little divots, and I just punched thousands and thousands of them, and I filled a cup with them. And I got one of the kids to come up front, and I handed him the cup, and I said, take a handful and throw it out in the audience. And he did, and I said, take the cup, just sling it everywhere. And he did, and they laughed, and they had a good time, and I said, now clean it up. Now, I was making the point that there's no way you will clean it up. If you ever spill that, you will find it for weeks. It'll be in the cuff of your pants. It'll be in your car. It'll be places that you can't even figure out how it got there. And that is the nature of gossip and our words. They spread to places that we never would have dreamed. And once you put it out there, you cannot clean it up.
I think you're exactly right. I remember years ago when I was in high school, there was a classmate of mine. She was sitting at the lunch table, and she was crying. And somebody had started the rumor, gossip, that she was pregnant. Now this girl wasn't pregnant. She was a good girl. Matter of fact, super girl, beautiful girl. And you think, why would someone start a rumor like that? Mm-hmm. And again, as you said a moment ago, just like the confetti, you throw it out, well, you can pick some of it up, but you can't get everything.
That's right.
And so by the same token, sometimes we can mar the reputations of others. And as a result of that, there are things that are said about someone, and unfortunately, there are remnants, pockets out here where people still believe that.
And you know, we got a lot of that going on right now in politics. Politics is filled with gossip. They'll leak little rumors and bits of information that doesn't have to be true because they know that people will take it and run with it.
I think you're right.
And it's character assassination.
It sure is.
That's the bottom line. It boils down to, it's a measurement of your character, and it's a definition of your ethic. And as far as biblically, I don't know that there's a better passage concerning biblical ethics than Micah 6:8. Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God.
That's right.
Do the right thing yourself, but when it comes to others, be merciful. And that would go a long way if I'm measuring my steps with that ethic, with that thought in mind, that even if it's something that is true, even if it is something that is horrible, mercy would pull back and withhold it and not want to add any sorrow or any pain to the situation.
I think so. The passage mentioned a moment ago, Proverbs 18:8, Solomon said the words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. I think one of the most disheartening things that happens to people is when they are, quote unquote, gutted by someone who is supposedly a close friend.
Right.
And how deeply that cut. And sometimes those wounds take a long, long time to heal.
You know, as kids, we were always told, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will not hurt me. But of course, we know that is not true. Some of the most painful things that we experience are words. I've used the illustration sometimes. Years ago, when I first started preaching, I had preached a sermon, and one of the members walked out on a particular day, and he said, "That was a really good sermon today." And then he paused for a minute and he said, "Which is very unusual for you." And he walked off, and it was just words of one man, but it really cut me. It cut
you
me
hard,
deeply. And I thought about that, and that's been 20 plus years ago. But words do hurt you.
They do. They really do.
They are oftentimes more painful than sticks and stones.
Absolutely.
One preacher put it this way. He said the difference between a gossip and a friend is the difference between a butcher and a surgeon. They both cut meat, but they both have different reasons and purposes.
That's right.
And
one does it with skill.
That's right, and there's a reason and a purpose for your good.
Exactly
and that's the whole idea. Am I helping or hurting? That's right. Bottom line on it.
You know, one of the greatest passages in the book of Psalms, I think, is Psalm 55. And the psalmist there, David, has been mistreated. He's been wronged, and he has been, as we said a moment ago, gutted. And in verse 4, he said, "My heart is severely pained within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling have come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me." And then he said, "Oh, that I had wings like a dove, then I would fly away and be at rest." And sometimes when people are hurt deeply, and sometimes those who are hurt deeply have been wounded by words, our desire is to just escape, get away. But in Psalm 55, David, in verse 12, he said, "It's not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it. Nor is it one who hates me, who has magnified himself against me, then I could hide from him." He said, "But it was you, a man my equal, my companion, my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together, walked to the house of God in the throng." I think about two people who are very, very close. But listen to him down in verse 20. He said, "He's put forth his hands against those who were at peace with him. He has broken his covenant." And then he says in verse 21, "The words of his mouth were smoother than butter." He said, "But war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords." And how many times have people stood face to face with someone and spoken about this individual in such glowing, kind, gracious words, terms, and then as soon as they leave, gut them.
And those who are close to you, when they say something, it really hurts. When a stranger says something, you don't really care. And I think that's why the words between a husband and a wife, when they get at odds with each other and they begin to say hurtful and hateful things, it hurts so deeply because this is someone that you care what they think, and it's a person who knows intimate things about you.
I think so. Got a question that's come in by way of email. When I hear something from someone that is gossip, without intending to listen to it, how should I handle it? Great question. Don, how would you address that?
Well, just because I hear something doesn't mean I have to repeat something. I can let go of it as easily as it came in if I will work to do that. And that's where it has to stop with you. If it doesn't stop with you, then who's it going to stop with? And so we have to keep that in mind. But that would be the point. I heard it, didn't want to hear it, but I'm certainly not going to repeat it at all, period.
And you might can disarm the person. If it's a person sharing gossip and you perceive that it's malicious, you might can question them or bring up something and suggest, well, maybe it's not the way you're thinking. Maybe there was, another explanation for this, and give the benefit of the doubt and let them know I'm not interested in participating in slander. I think that there is a viable explanation for this.
And maybe sometimes we're too prone to think the worst case scenario rather than giving them the benefit of the doubt. As Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, love thinketh no evil. And yet sometimes we're quick to pass judgment on something when maybe we don't have all the facts. I know that in looking at the Scriptures, the church is identified as the blood-bought body of Christ. How can gossip damage a local congregation? How would, I guess, Don, from the perspective of a preacher, I know you've served as an elder before, but how can gossip literally destroy a good congregation?
Well, let's think back to Matthew 18. We've alluded to that several times already. Matthew 18 suggests, in fact, I would suggest that Matthew 18 is gossip control. That's what that is. You've got an issue between you and a brother. He sinned against you. Mm-hmm. The Lord says, go to him privately. You keep it very, very limited. And if he won't hear you, you're going to take one or two. It's interesting, he doesn't say that you go and tell them all of this. They're going to come and be witnesses. Now imagine if you do go and tell them. You go and say, no, this brother's done this to me. You get these two. This brother, so you win them to your side. They've heard your side, so now they're prejudiced. So now you're kind of building people on your side as you go and do this. If you start doing that sort of thing, and then they tell people, well, what you start having is a division in the church. True. You've got people who are taking this side and people who are taking this side because we're ignoring what the Lord has said about this. And sometimes we do this perhaps under the guise of getting advice. We'll go to someone and we're really wanting to share this information or spread it, and we'll say, I'd like to have your advice on this. This person has wronged me, and we'll use that as an excuse. And the person will say, well, I can't believe they did that. And the next thing you know, you've got a division in the congregation. Sure. Because we didn't follow the way the Lord said in Matthew chapter 18, because that is gossip control. It only goes to the church publicly when this person will not repent, and as an effort to save their soul, we're going to have to make this public.
That's right. I like that, Matthew chapter 18, gossip control. What are some other preventatives with regard to gossip in the church, Don? Like we mentioned Matthew chapter 7, the golden rule. Are there some other characteristics that would help us?
It's always the principle. Jesus said that there was a man, the demon was cast out, but nothing good was put in. And then he came back with 7 others that were worse. If we're edifying, and if that's our goal to build up and to help and to strengthen, then gossip becomes a tool against what we're investing in. And so if we will busy ourselves with the building up, the exhortation, the encouragement, those positive things that not only help the one that's doing it, but helps the one that they're speaking to, right, then you're not going to want to work against yourself by gossiping and tearing down after you've already put the effort to build up.
And Mike, we might mention this too when we're thinking about gossip control, is if we can realize how serious this is. Proverbs 18:21 says, death and life are in the power of the tongue. I don't think that's talking about physical death and physical life. I think he is talking about eternal death. Right. That is, that you'll lose your soul over this. Right. And I think oftentimes when we think about our words, we don't think they're that serious. We think, adultery, that's serious. Murder, that's serious. Oftentimes the physical things, but issues of the heart we have a tendency to dismiss. Our words, that's not that big a deal. If we could emphasize and keep this in our minds and our hearts, that I will lose my soul over this, what better control will there be?
Great point. In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter talks about how Christ left us an example that we should follow in his steps. In verse 22, he said, who committed no sin, nor was guile, deceit found in his mouth. In chapter 3, Peter said, he that would love life, see good days, listen to him, let him refrain his tongue from evil. That would include gossip, wouldn't it? Definitely. And then he said, and his lips from speaking guile or deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Right. And that's sound advice when it comes to gossip.
Well, that goes back to James 3. If a man's able to bridle his tongue, then he's able to control the whole body. That tells me that that is worth my effort. And whatever I invest in being able to put that bridle on my tongue, I'm going to be able to also use that. If my eyes stray, I can bring them back in easier, in an easier way. And so it helps strengthen me, so it's worth my investment in that way.
In Psalm 19:14, David said in that psalm, and I think as a prayer also, he says, "Let the meditation of my heart and the words of my mouth," let me read it. He says, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable unto thee, O Lord." Imagine if we're praying that and we're thinking that. Every word that comes out, every thought that I have, I want it to be acceptable to the Lord. That's going to help. That's going to help in gossip.
Absolutely. And if Jesus is our great example, and we know that he would never have stooped to gossip,
Right.
then if we're going to follow in His
not at all.
footsteps, we're not
Exactly.
going to do so as well. Another question that's come in. What should I do when I hear gossip from someone? Should I go to the person who was gossiped about and warn them, or is that more gossip? Again, a great question tonight. How would you guys respond to this?
I think Don's got a good answer to that.
I would say initially no. I would say deal with the one that's doing the gossiping first. If it's going to help by letting the other one know, will it help them in some way? Then perhaps consider going to them. But the gossiper is the one that needs to be addressed. And you're doing wrong, you need to stop, let it go no further. And then the one that's being gossiped about, if they never find out about it, if your brother repents, you've gained the brother, and you haven't alienated the two from each other.
Sure.
You nipped it before it got there.
It makes good sense because the principle of Matthew 18 in gossip control is making as few people as possible aware of the sin, and that's consistent with that answer.
I've got a question in light of this question. Let's just say hypothetically that there's someone watching this program, or maybe we know someone who has a problem with gossip, and they have fallen into the habit of being a gossip. Mm-hmm. So how would a person break that habit? What are some principles that would help them to learn to bridle their tongue and to just cease gossiping?
When someone comes to me with, they struggle in a specific area, whatever it might be, gossip will be what we're speaking about tonight. What I tell them to do is, what you need to do is you need to go to God's Word, and you need to find those passages that address that issue, that problem. And you need to write those down, type them out, put them in your pocket, and you need to start bringing those to your mind. And whenever you find yourself at the point where you want to talk about someone, you want to gossip, you pull those out if you haven't got them committed to your mind yet. And you read those first. And what you're doing, you're training your mind. You're being renewed in the spirit of your mind, and you're letting the Word of God do it. And the more you do that, what will happen is you'll find yourself not pulling the paper out so much, but the verses will come to your mind immediately.
Which is really sound advice, because in Colossians chapter 3, Paul said, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. In other words, let it find a home in your heart.
I would suggest this also. Pray about this very specifically. Most of us know what our particular shortcomings are, and I think most of us know if we have a tendency to gossip. Go to God and pray, give me strength in this. That does a couple of things. You get the power of prayer. We believe that the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. But it's also making me conscious. I'm concentrating. I'm working on this. I love the idea of having the Scripture in your pocket. But something that helps a lot of people in a lot of areas is to have someone helping you. Mm-hmm. If you're a woman and you're struggling with this, maybe say to your husband, I'm struggling with this. I want to overcome this. When you hear me do this, I want you to stop me.
That's good.
And then be prepared when they stop you. Don't get angry, but have the heart, yes, and calling your attention to it.
Well, you know, the Hebrew writer talks about those besetting sins.
Right.
And there are certain things that are problematic to certain people. And so, you know, the goal is to rise above it, overcome it, and we can do it with the help of God.
We could expect some assistance even in a providential way. If I pray, I need to be ready for an answer. Help me, Father, in this area of gossip. I'm working on it. And then if something happens that I'm gossiping and all of a sudden someone confronts me about it and it becomes uncomfortable and unpleasant, that may be God's providence saying, look what you're doing here. Think about it. You've prayed to me about it, and now fix it.
And
so
you know,
there are
don't
a
you
lot
think,
of ways.
Don't you think, you know, Jesus talked about loving our neighbor as ourselves. And if we genuinely love, love our neighbor and love ourselves, then you know, that's going to help to be a safeguard, so to speak. If we love someone as we love ourselves, then that's going to help to be a safeguard in the gossip arena. Another question's come in. At what point should I rebuke someone who is a gossip? I don't know that they're gossiping unless I hear it first. Yeah, another good question.
You know, I have actually had this experience, and my father-in-law did this to me on one occasion. I brought up something and said something I should not have to him, brought it up, and he responded in a very abrupt way and said something like, Don, I think that's something that a Christian shouldn't say. And when he said it, it was painful, and it cut me, and it ended it. Mm-hmm. And I learned a powerful lesson out of that. It made me angry for just a second, but I looked back and I reflected on it, and I thought, number one, that was probably difficult for him to do, sure, but he recognized it and he stopped it. And I also got to thinking, what if everyone that heard something like this responded in that way? It was very helpful to me in the long run.
Sure, sure.
And appreciated, I'm sure.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think, I think that there's a lot to be said for somebody caring enough to correct us
right,
when problems arise. So another great question. One of the, I guess we've talked about some of the preventatives and obviously breaking the habit of gossip. What about as a Christian? What if I know someone has the problem of being a gossip, and I've seen the seeds of discord that have been sown by that person? Should I, as an individual Christian, try to rectify this situation or try to counsel this person, or would it be better to maybe get the eldership to do it? What would be best, Don? You
know, I think if I am aware, if I have just heard it, my approach might depend on the situation. Is this, how have I heard this information? How has it come to my attention? If it's because they have said it to me, maybe you take the approach that I just mentioned a moment ago. Or maybe you take a slightly gentler approach. The next time they do it, you wait for it to come up. The next time they do it, you say, do you think that might be gossip? And just ask. Uh-huh. And it's going to stop them in their tracks. And mm-hmm. any person who wants to be a Christian and wants to be right, they're going to stop. And I think very often they're going to respond and say something like, you're probably right.
Well, also Galatians 6:1 would be there, and that would be ye that are spiritual, go to them in a manner of meekness, considering yourself. Gentleness, considering yourself. You don't want to push them over, but you do want to Absolutely. Help persuade them biblically.
What about in a congregation? Let's say, for example, sometimes there are people in a certain town, and they're known as the town gossip. Mm-hmm. But sadly, sometimes in the church, there are people that have the reputation as being a gossip. So would that be something that the elders would want to address, or would it be something that maybe the individual members would want to address?
You know, I preached for a congregation years ago. I would not reveal the congregation, but there was a woman in the congregation, and she was known in the community as a gossip and known for lying. And on one occasion, she spread something about me that was a lie. It wasn't particularly harmful, but it still was a lie. And I went to the elders and I said something to them about this. And they said, Don, she's a gossip and a liar, and everybody knows it. Don't worry about it. I want you to ponder that for a minute. That shows a very low regard for her soul and for the Lord's church. Because if she's a gossip and a liar and everyone knows it, well, she's going to lose her soul over that. Those elders need to address that because her soul is at stake, and it's reflecting on the precious body of Jesus Christ. And those elders are going to give an account for that on the day of judgment.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And a very low thought of their responsibility.
Right.
I mean, it's just hard to imagine someone that's a leader who's tending the sheep, who'll give an account for every soul, waving it off so easily.
It was shocking to me.
Mm-hmm. It would be shocking. Yeah. What about, sometimes information is passed along to other people as being truth, but in reality, it's gossip. In other words, maybe there is some truth to it. But the question, I guess, why would someone pass along negative information about another person?
Well, we don't stop, and we don't think about it, and we don't go a little deeper in our thoughts. It really boils down to attitude, emphasis, motive, and we ask ourselves, even if it's true, doesn't necessarily mean it's not gossip. Mm-hmm. And we have to ask ourselves, what's the value? Are we edifying or are we tearing down? Is this going to help or is it going to hurt? Is it of any value or is it empty? All of these things have to be considered, and too often we just don't take the time to really think about the statement, think about how we respond to it in those terms and in that light.
And you know, there are times when we become privileged to certain information. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul said, "It hath been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household, that there are contentions among you." Right. Well, Paul obviously was in the know about the problems at Corinth, but he addressed those problems and he did it in a biblical way.
Right. And that's what we're talking about. It goes back to the motive. Elders sometimes have to address negative things. What is your heart? Is it relishing the fact that I've got this information, or is it grieved by the fact that I have this information and trying to see what I can do to help this person and help remedy it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
There should be some difficulty with us if we're dealing with something like this, information such as this, that is harmful or something that will not build up. It ought to be difficult for us to talk to someone else about it. But sometimes it's needful. It's essential that we do it for the soul.
Absolutely. Well, look at the writings of Paul. Paul spoke of weeping for people, and there are certain things that ought to break our heart.
Right.
In the lives of people.
Mike, I know we're getting short on time, but I wanted to read this passage because I think that it's a good note as we're starting to wrap things up. Proverbs 21:23 says, "Whoever guards his mouth and his tongue keeps his soul from troubles." Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that I think will help us if we're convinced this passage is true. If you want your life to be good and you don't want there to be drama all the time, keep your mouth closed.
I think so.
and don't share anything like this.
Well, and one of the things that you brethren mentioned tonight, the seriousness of what we're talking about, and the fact that one day we're going to stand before God and give an account of how we've used our tongue, either for good or bad.
Yeah.
That's right.
I want to encourage everyone to be a part of our program next week. We're going to be talking about church attendance. Is it important? What about Sunday nights, Wednesday nights? I know these are questions that people have, and so we're going to deal with this next week. Look forward to discussing this and want you to be a part of our program. Might be you have some questions. Feel free to give us a call or even email us with your questions, and we'll do our best to answer those next week. On behalf of our panel, again, Don, thank you so much for being here. Don.
Yes, sir.
I got Don 1, Don 2, but we appreciate so much these guys being here tonight. Appreciate you being a part of our program. We're so grateful for the opportunity that we have to come into your home every week. And look, we hope to see you again right back here next Thursday night. Until then, God bless.